Let's talk about the super wealthy, subject that I like to talk about. Oops, let me get my technology straight here. So, when we talk in this country today about the super wealthy, as Michael just said, we automatically talk about the 1%. And this is something that's fairly new. 6 years ago, there was no conversation about the 1%. But Occupy in 2011, the Bernie Sanders campaign more recently, have made the 1% and the 99% the way we think about our economy. But there's a problem here, as Michael said. The 1% includes many more people than the ultra rich. In fact, the gap between the top of the 1% and the bottom of the 1% is much wider than the gap between the bottom of the 1% and everybody else. So let's look at some numbers. Let's look at U.S. income averages in 2014. Here we have, let me swing around here. It's easier for me to read this too. Here we have the average income of the bottom 90%, $32,000. Not very much. The average income of the bottom half of the top 1%, about $460,000. Moving up, the next 4/10 of the top 1%, $852,000. Finally, the top 1/10 of 1%, enormously more than the rest of the 1% that we have here. So what does it take to move in to these categories that we're talking about? Well, if we're talking about the 1%, it takes under $400,000 to enter the top 1%. Oops. Our next segment here, the top half of 1%, $573,000. And to enter the top 1/10 of 1%, over $1.5 million. So in other words, entering the top 1/10 of 1% takes averaging nearly $300,000 per week in income. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? What do these numbers mean? Well, they mean that many professional couples can actually rate as 1%ers. So if we take the average dentist in the United States today, and we add on a spouse who is the average anesthesiologist, what we have is a top 1% income. But we don't have anything near a top 0.1% income. In fact, this couple would have to make over $1 million more a year to qualify as top 1/10 of 1%. So what happens when we look at wealth? Well, we have the same basic story. Let's look at U.S. average family net worth in 2012. Here we go with the average net worth of the bottom 80%, bottom 90% rather, moving up to the next 9%, and then moving up to the bottom 90% of the top 1%. And then finally, the average wealth of the top 1/10 of 1%. And when we think about this, one of the striking things is that this gap within the top 1% has actually been widening over time. So if we look back over recent decades, we see that back in the 1970s, the component pieces of the top 1% all had about the same share of income dollars. But over time, that has changed. And the top 1/10 of 1% now significantly dominate the rest of the 1%. Let's look at share of U.S. family wealth again in 2012. The bottom 50% of American families, American households, bottom 90%. Thank you, Michael. A little over 22%. The next 9%, a little bit more. The next, and the top 1/10 of 1%. So essentially, the top 1/10 of 1% has as much wealth as the entire bottom 90% of American families. Okay, what makes the top 1/10 of 1% so rich? Where do they get their money? Well, this chart sort of tries to break that down. A huge chunk of the income of the ultra-rich, the top 1/10 of 1%, comes from capital gains, from the profits off the sale of assets, stocks and bonds and real estate. Another sizable chunk comes from capital income, the income that assets generate, dividends, interests, rents, royalties, things like that. And then we have the profits from personally owned businesses. Here we have partnership income, hedge and private equity fund income. And finally, a huge chunk comes from what we use the shorthand of CEO pay to describe, the pay that goes to top executives in the economy. And this share, as you can see here, has substantially increased and makes up a major share of the wealth of the top 1/10 of 1%. Okay, these are all numbers. Let's look at types of people who sit in the top 1%. Let's start where we ended that with the executive class, with the corporate executive class. Over 40% of top 1/10 of 1%ers come from this corporate executive class. Then if we add in Wall Street, we get another sizable chunk. And then if we add in what used to be called coupon clippers, that is rich people who aren't working, just living off the income of their investments, you have another nice piece. So here you have, between the corporate executive class, Wall Street, and coupon clippers, we have essentially 2/3 of the top 10 of 1%. Add in lawyers, another little piece. Add in real estate people, think Donald Trump. Add in medical, people who owned labs and all sorts of things like that. Add in assorted entrepreneurs. And finally, we come to celebrities. Celebrities make up essentially 3 out of every 100 top 1/10 of 1%ers, which is very much what you would not think looking at the American media. But all the movie stars, all the big singers, all the big athletes, all the big network news anchors, they make up a very, very tiny fraction of the 1/10%. And then we have various other categories, also very small. But the big story here is that the corporate executive class and Wall Street together make up the great bulk of that top 1/10 of 1%. Okay, we've been talking all this time so far about the United States. Let's look globally and look at what the situation is. And most of these global stats come from the best source of inequality numbers worldwide, and that's the Credit Suisse Bank in Switzerland, of all things. Their research institute is very highly regarded. So let's look at what Credit Suisse has to say. People in the world, adults in the world, who own less than $10,000 in assets make up 71% of the world's population. The next chunk, people who own between 10 and 100,000, make up another 21% of the world's population. moving up to people from 100,000 to 1 million, 7%. And then people in the world who are actually millionaires, have $1 million in net worth, make up less than 1%. Okay, that's how the population breaks down. How does the wealth break down? Well, people in that first category hold a tiny, tiny piece of the world's wealth. We go up a little bit, also a tiny piece. We go up a little further, that piece grows, we get to millionaires. Wow, they have a huge chunk of the world's wealth. Now, I think most Americans are well aware that our rich are doing much, much better than everybody else. But I think what most Americans don't realize is that America's rich are phenomenally more rich more wealthy than affluent people in the rest of the world. So let's look at absolute number of millionaires in millions. In Switzerland, about 2/3 of a million. Moving up, Australia, Canada, Italy, China, Germany, France. We're over 1 million millionaires now. Japan, UK, USA. Quite a contrast. We have 3 million more adults worth at least 1 million than the rest of the world's top 10 millionaire nations combined. But that's just millionaires. That's not top 1/10 of 1%. That's millionaires. That's a broader group. Let's go up and let's look at what the people at Credit Suisse call ultra high net worth individuals, people who have over $50 million in assets. Let's start with the USA. That's the USA chunk worldwide of this population. That's China, number 2. So US millionaires make up 46% of the global millionaire total, but US $50 million folks make up an even greater proportion, nearly half of the world's population of ultra-high net wealth individuals. Okay, what explains the wealth of the ultra-wealthy? Well, there's one favorite explanation that the flocks for grand fortune tend to use, and that's what I would call the inevitability thesis, that they say we live in a totally globalized world economy. And in this huge globalized world economy, if you win, if you're successful, you have a lot of success. You get very rich. And as long as we're living in a globalized world economy, we have to accept inequality as an inevitable. But if that were true, then it seems to me that in the developed world, if all the developed nations are competing in the same globalized economy, it would seem to me that we would have some uniform trends within the top 1/10 of 1% by nation. And indeed, we did back in the middle of the 20th century. So if we look at the various reports, the various data sets that we have from the middle of the 20th century, we find that in Netherlands, the top 10th of 1% held almost 4% of national, made about almost 4% of national income. Germany, France, Japan, UK, and the USA. And remember, this is back in the middle of the 20th century. And at that time, other nations, the top 1/10 of 1% of other nations were taking in more income than the top 1/10 of 1% in the United States. Now let's move ahead a half a century. In the Netherlands, the top 1/10 of 1% share actually sank. In Germany, up a little. In France, up a little. Japan, up a little. The UK, up a little bit more. And in the USA, that share more than doubled. let's move up a little bit. We're talking about the top 1/10 of 1%. Let's move into what Bernie Sanders has made famous as the billionaire class. And specifically, let's look at the 62 richest billionaires in the world and compare them to the total combined wealth of the bottom 50%, the bottom half of humanity. Well, if we look at 1910, those 62 richest billionaires had $1.1 trillion in net worth. And the bottom half, the poorer half of humanity, that's the entire human race, had more. But if we go up to 2015, after 5 years of Great Recession, the billionaires, the 62 top billionaires, have significantly increased their net worth, and the bottom half of humanity in our austerity times has lost out. So in other words, you could fit those 62 billionaires, a group small enough to squeeze into a bus. This busload of billionaires now has more wealth than the entire bottom half of humanity. One bus full of billionaires owns more wealth than all of the bottom 50%. Okay, so the question is, should any of this bother us? Well, the apologists for the super rich say no, of course. And their most common rationale is that the more wealth concentrates at the top, the more the job creators will create jobs and prosperity, and everybody benefits. And that's, of course, their prime line. But in real life, as I think probably everybody here knows, little wealth ever trickles down. And one interesting way of looking at this is comparing United States and France. France is a significantly more equal nation than the United States. So this is data, Credit Suisse data from 2014. And you see in the USA that year, the average adult wealth was about $350,000. So in other words, you take all the wealth in the United States and divide that up by the number of adults, and you get $350,000 or so. Yeah, so mean is average here, as opposed to, as we'll see in a second, as opposed to median. So that's the mean, that's the average. Now let's look at the median. And remember, median is that point in a distribution where half of what you're measuring is below and half is above. So the best synonym for median is typical. So how much did the typical American adult have as opposed to the average American adult? The typical American adult had that. The typical French adult living in a much more equal nation had that. So in other words, if the United States had an economy as equal, as it has a distribution of wealth as equal as France's was in 2014, the typical American adult would have had nearly triple his or her adult net worth. In a sense, that's the penalty that working people in the United States pay for living in a wildly, staggeringly unequal nation. Inequality just means less for average people. Let's bring some other nations into this framework. This is more recent data from 2015. So median wealth per adult, that's typical wealth. This is what we would call the average person, the typical person has. We have Belgium, Norway, Japan, Canada, Netherlands, the USA. Again, working people in the United States are paying every day, every year, a penalty for living in a deeply unequal society. Last year, we had in the United States quadruple the wealth. We quadrupled the wealth of the next richest country. But the unequal distribution of that left average Americans behind the 8 ball. But the conventional wisdom in the United States is still very potent. And I'm not talking about the conventional wisdom just among conservatives, but I'm talking about the conventional wisdom on among a broad swatch of our political elite. And that conventional wisdom says this. It says, you're just envious if you talk about the wealth of the wealthy. Forget about wealth at the top. Focus on helping people in need at the bottom. Talking about the rich just distracts and divides us. So why do that? Let's help the people at the bottom. And this sense has been, over the past recent decades, very rooted in the U.S. political elite class. And not just among conservatives. So here's David Bonyer in 1995. The problem in America today isn't that some people are getting rich. The problem is that most people are getting nowhere. David Bonyer in 1995 was one of the most liberal members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Here's Laura D'Andrea Tyson, who is Bill Clinton's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And she said, imagine our income distribution as an apartment building with a penthouse ever more luxurious and a rat-infested basement. What to do? Pillage the penthouse? No. Do something about that rat-infested basement. That's what we need to do. And here's Howard Dean when he was campaigning for president in 2004. The thing to do is concentrate on the 90% of people who don't have what they need and make sure they have it, and not worry about the people who make $500,000 a year. Of course it's obscene, but so what? And just to be bipartisan here, here's Greg Mankiw, the Harvard economist, who was the chair of George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors and later was a key advisor to Romney. And he said the question is, how do we help people at the bottom rather than thwart people at the top? So it's a very strong sense. And my favorite quote across this line, the most vivid imagery of nonchalance towards the concentration of wealth, comes from Dalton Conley, the Dean of Social Sciences at NYU. He wrote in the American Prospect, which is a very good liberal magazine, he wrote this in 2009. Let's worry about making sure the circuitry of the American dream is enshorted rather than whether some folks draw more current from the grid. Don't worry about those rich people. But a
counter-narrative is gaining strength. It's the narrative, again, that came from Occupy. It's a narrative, again, that is coming from the Bernie Sanders campaign. And this narrative essentially says that how much wealth a developed society generates really matters little to our well-being. What really matters is the distribution, how a developed society distributes its overall wealth. Intellectually, the two people leading this counter narrative are Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, epidemiologists from the UK. They have done a great deal of work over the years on life expectancy. And what they found is that people in more equal societies live longer than people in more unequal societies. But not just poor people, all people. So if you're a middle-income person in a deeply unequal nation like the United States, you're going to have a shorter life than a middle-income person in a more equal nation. And they've documented this reality in a number of different studies, as have scores of other epidemiologists. Those are scientists who study the health of populations around the world. So Pickett and Wilkinson asked, well, what would happen if we looked at other social conditions? Would we see this same sort of phenomenon? And what they concluded that is if you want to know why one country does better or worse than another, the first thing to look at is the extent of inequality. And their great book, 6 years old now, The Spirit Level, talks about that. So let me give you some charts from their work that I find really fascinating. What we have here on the vertical axis is the prevalence of mental illness. So the higher on that axis you go, the more mental illness. Then on the bottom axis, we have the degree of inequality. So the more to the right you go, the higher the inequality. So you see Japan down in the left corner has low mental illness and low inequality. And as you see, the other nations on this chart sort of track that course. The more inequality in the nation, the more mental illness, ending at the top right with the US of A, the most inequality of these nations and the most mental illness. We look at teenage birth rates, the same phenomenon. At the lower left, in the good category with low levels of teenage birth rates and low levels of inequality are the more equal nations, Finland, Sweden, Japan. All the way up in the right corner, the more unequal nations, and the most unequal of all, the United States. The same dynamic on obesity. The more unequal the nation, the more obesity. The same dynamic on drug abuse. The more inequality, the more drug abuse. UNICEF does an index. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Agency, does an index that rates nations on children's well-being. This is a little bit reversed here. So the high children's well-being is at the top left. And there you see the more equal nations. Down at the lower right, the more unequal nations, of course, with the U.S. prominently there. Look at homicide rates, the same dynamic. You look at the number of people in prisons, the same dynamic. USA is almost off the chart here. You look at social mobility, that is, what are the odds that someone born poor is going to move up to a higher economic level? Well, those odds are very high in more equal nations. They're basement low in the United States. And finally, if we put all those different indicators together, this is what we get. And the picture is absolutely striking of how well these results track the growth of inequality by nation. Again, at the bottom rather, in any sort of social accounting, in the worst slot, sits the United States. Okay, what yardstick? All these slides talk about inequality, but what yardstick of inequality did this analysis use? Well, this analysis used quintiles. All this work compared the top 20% versus the bottom 20%, and that was the measure of inequality. And Wilkinson and Pickett and other investigators have used this commonly use this yardstick because it's the best data that we have available. So if you look at this yardstick of top 20 versus bottom 20, you see the United States down over there is over twice as unequal as the countries that are most equal. But this doesn't tell us much about the top 0.1%. This tells us that if you live in a country where the top 20% has a lot more money than the bottom 20%, you're asking for trouble. But it doesn't particularly tell us about the role of the top 1% or the role of the top 0.1%. And if we want to get into that role, we have to go back in time. We have to go back to the classic critique of grand fortune that emerged in the original Gilded Age over a century ago. And that basic critique said that enormous concentrations of private wealth threaten our democracy. Now we need to remember that in the early 1900s, Americans lived in a society that was even more unequal than ours today. This is a picture from Newport, Rhode Island, one of the favorite watering holes of the super rich at the turn of the last century. And this is an apartment from the Lower East Side in New York. And amid this incredible inequality, this incredible wealth on one hand and incredible poverty at the other hand, a progressive consensus emerged among reformers and revolutionaries alike. And all those reformers, wherever they stood on the political scale, they agreed that to create a decent society, we had to do two things. We had to address the absence of wealth at the bottom, at society's base, and we had to address the concentration of wealth at society's summit. We can either have, said Louis Brandeis, who went on to become a great Supreme Court justice, we can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And so what we had, driven by this progressive consensus, was we had years of struggle that actually leveled down and leveled up America. We had unions leveling up the bottom. Here's a chart that shows the union coverage, number of people represented by unions. It went from a fraction to well over a quarter, almost a third of the U.S. workforce by the middle of the 20th century. At the same time, high taxes were leveling down the top. The top marginal tax rate, in other words, the tax rate on income in the highest income bracket, went from 25% in the 1920s to 91% in the 1950s. And when I say struggle, there was a lot of struggle that made all of this happen. And my favorite statistic of all, in 1946, 1 out of every 10 workers in the United States went out on strike at some point in the year. Here's a shot from the National Coal Miners Walkout, one of the more famous, and a shot from a North Carolina strike, much less famous, but tremendous turbulence that changed the face of the country. And what happened by the middle of the 20th century is that the top 1/10% no longer dominated the wealth of the nation. So let's look at the top 1%, top 1/10% income as a multiple of average bottom 90% income. In the 1920s, that top 1/10% made 137 times the average income of the bottom 90%. By the middle of the 20th century, that was down to 30 times. An enormous change, enormous sea change in American life. But in the middle of the 20th century, something happened that busted apart the progressive consensus that we needed to both level up and level down. And that something was the Cold War. We had hysteria in this country. The Red Menace. I married a communist. In this atmosphere, anyone who talked about limiting wealth at the top started sounding incredibly subversive. People lost their jobs if they sounded subversive. People suffered, and people started stopping talking about this. And a new elite consensus emerges. And this consensus holds, let's stop fighting over how we divide the economic pie. Let's grow the pie instead so everyone gets a bigger piece. Let's not talk about the distribution of wealth. Let's only talk about the creation of wealth. The only thing that matters is growth, economic growth, nothing else. Growth becomes the amazing everybody wins solution. John Kennedy asked Congress to spur growth by cutting the top tax rate on the rich from 91 to 65%. And he says famously, as they say on my own Cape Cod, a rising tide lifts all the boats. If we just had growth, we'll be fine. Congress cuts the top tax rate to 70% 3 months after Kennedy's assassination. Ronald Reagan comes on 16 years later, and he takes the logical next step. And that logical next step, well, if cutting taxes at the top a little will grow the economy, as JFK claimed, why not cut taxes a lot? And so that's what Reagan and Congress proceeded to do. And by 1986, the top marginal tax rate was down to 28%, very close to the top rate just before the Great Depression of 25%. And so we have an America that's no longer using the income tax to level down the top. And here are those tax rates. All the way up at their height, they went up to 94% during World War II. During all the Eisenhower years, they were above 90%. Right now, the top marginal tax rate is 39.6%, less than half the top rate back in the middle of the 20th century. Meanwhile, unions are no longer leveling up the bottom. The union coverage rate in the workforce, combined public and private, is way down. So what has essentially happened? Well, on every major rule that determines how the economy operates, the wealthy have rigged the game. Rigged the game on their behalf to the detriment of working people. There are a number of great books that talk about this process. The Jacob Hacker book, David K. Johnston book looking at taxes, a wonderful, wonderful new book from Jane Mayer of the New Yorker about billionaires. Great stuff that we don't have time, of course, to go into today. But talk step by step on how the rules were changed, how the top 0.1% used their clout in all sorts of different forums to change how the economy operates. And the key thing, of course, is that rule rigging continues full-blown today. And let's look at close up at just one piece of that rule rigging by the Koch brothers, Charles and David. Let's look at what they have spent to influence public policy in a 5-year period, 2007 through 2011. They've made almost over $40 million in that period of contributions to public policy, nonprofits. direct contributions to candidates. This is not super PACs. This is just direct contributions to candidates of $10 million. Donations to over 200 colleges and universities, again for public policy studies of one sort or another, and their lobbyists arm, over $50 million. Most of this was secret. Sometimes things become public. For instance, the Koch brother donation to Florida State University became public, where the Kochs gave money to the economics department, and the contract that they signed gave them approval over course content and things like reading lists. I mean, how much more direct can you get? So together, they spent over $134 million. This is just two brothers influencing public policy. Well, that brings us to campaign 2016. Earlier this year, the Kochs announced that they and their 300 closest buddies who make up their super rich political network will be spending $889 million in 2016 elections. That's their budget for this cycle. And let's put that in perspective. In the last presidential election cycle, the Republican National Committee, on all its presidential and congressional work, so the Republican Senate Campaign Committee, the Republican House Campaign Committee, all those committees together spend considerably less than just the Koch brothers and their close friends will be spending this year. So in other words, the Republican Party officially has become sort of an afterthought to these plutocrats. And here's another, Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson is the casino magnate who lives in Las Vegas and owes his wealth to casinos there and in Macau, China. He has pledged to Donald Trump now, to the 2016 GOP nominee, he has pledged $100 million. That's what he's going to be spending this year. Let's put that in perspective. You know Bernie's figure of $27? The number of $27 contributions needed to equal $100 million is 3.7 million. So this is one man, one vote plutocracy style. One man has the power to offset 3.7 million people. That's democracy 2016. So, I mean, one obvious question is how much more dominant can the ultra-rich become? Well, let's track the share of campaign contributions that have come from the richest, not 0.1%, but 0.01%. So this is the top tenth of the top tenth richest people in the United States. So back in 1980, they contributed that. They moved along in the 1980s, pretty stable, their share, but then it started going up. And in 2012, over 40% of all the campaign contributions in the United States came from the richest 1/100th of 1%. That's 25,000 people. The question this begs, at what point does a democracy cease to be a democracy? Well, last year I interviewed Benjamin Page. He's a political scientist at Northwestern University outside of Chicago. He's the leading scholar on the impact of the wealthy on public policy. He and his co-author of a major 2014 study examined almost 1,800 federal public policy disputed areas of policy over a 20-year period, and then based his conclusions on that. So I put this question to him, and here's what Ben had to say. I would say there are degrees of democratic responsiveness. You can imagine perfect democracy or a situation without any democracy at all, or anywhere in between. Drawing a line to say precisely where democracy begins would be arbitrary. But if you observe the United States right now, you discover that the average citizen has no detectable influence on policy. No detectable influence on policy. That's not much of a democracy. And remember, Ben Page isn't speaking off the top of his head. He's talking on the basis of a study of 1,800 different public policy issues. So as a democracy, we have clearly entered uncharted territory. Lester Thoreau, who passed away, great economist who passed away this past spring, 20 years ago, he said something I thought was very prophetic. Historically, some very successful societies have existed for millennia with the enormous equalities of wealth and income. Ancient Egypt, Imperial Rome, classical China, the Incas, the Aztecs. But all these societies had political and social ideologies that fit this economic reality. None believed in inequality in any sense. And not theoretically, not politically, not socially, not economically. Democracies have a problem with rising economic inequality precisely because they believe in political equality. How far can we stretch this? We don't know. We're in uncharted territory. But the thing that keeps me an optimist is that we can become more equal. We know we can because we once did. And we go back to that chart of the multiples of 0.1% income as a multiple of bottom 90% income. We went from the 1920s to the middle of the 20th century. We became substantially more equal. And then, of course, we've lost all that ground, and that's where we are today. Okay, how can we get back on the road to equality? One thing we need to do is we need to recreate the 20th century institutional foundation for greater equality. We need a tax system progressive enough to level down the super rich. We need a labor movement strong enough to level up the poor. But we need to realize that this double-fisted agenda from the 20th century didn't turn out to be enough to sustain equality in that last century. We need to do more. So let's talk about a bold step toward going beyond, a step that Michael hinted at in his introduction. We already have minimum wages. How about a maximum wage? Is that an off-the-wall notion? Not at all. Not to Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States. In April 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt called for a maximum wage. He asked the U.S. Congress to place a 100% tax on all individual income over $25,000, a 100% tax. $25,000 then is about $350,000 today. Congress did not go along to FDR. They did not buy a 100% top rate, but Congress did buy a 94% top rate. As we saw before, that 90% top rate essentially stayed in effect for the next 2 decades. But this maximum wage notion predates FDR. In the late 1800s, Felix Adler, some of you may know, is the founder of the Ethical Culture Society. He proposed the first 100% top tax rate. During World War I, the brother of the governor of Pennsylvania, an anti-war leader, Amos Pinchot, called for a 100% tax. E.W. Scripps of the Scripps-Howard newspaper chain fame called for a 100% tax on all income over $50,000. And indeed, there was a mass citizens movement during World War I, led by a number of different unions that called for this 100% top tax rate. But what about today? Is this notion out from the shadows, this notion of a maximum wage? And I'm not clicking here. Well, I think all over the world, people are starting to talk about this idea. In the UK, a couple of years ago, the head of the British Labour movement announced that leading UK unions will vote the shares their pension funds hold against any executive pay plans that compensate CEOs at over 20 times average worker pay. We're going to use the power of our pension funds to make a difference, said the TUC president. Talking Swiss maximum. A few years ago in Switzerland, they had a referendum on the notion of capping executive pay so no executive would make more in a month than workers made in a year. And that vote failed, but it got over a third of the electorate's support. In Canada, a very active new organization called WageMark is pushing to honor corporations and companies and firms that keep their wage top to bottom ratio at 8:1. In France, a public opinion poll found massive support for the idea of capping income. And in the United States, just one little thing that I found fascinating, that in 2014, the Faculty Senate at St. Mary's College, which is a very prestigious public college in Maryland, narrowly voted down a plan to limit the pay of St. Mary's president to 10 times the college's lowest worker pay. And so this is emerging conversation now, all around the world. People are starting to talk this idea about capping income. And what I see emerging is a consensus among maximum wage activists. And that holds that we don't need to cap the income of the super rich at a fixed figure. We need a cap on the gap between the rich and the rest of us. We need to wage what I like to call a ratio politics and try to build a solidarity economy. And in a solidarity economy, if we tied pay to the top to pay at the bottom, then people at the top can only advance if people at the bottom advance first. So our richest and most powerful people for the first time would have a vested interest in not exploiting our weakest and poorest people, but helping them rise up. Now, we've actually taken a first step towards a ratio American. The Dodd-Frank Act, enacted 6 years ago, mandates corporate pay ratio disclosure. This provision in Dodd-Frank was slipped in at the last minute by progressive-minded senators. Corporate America didn't know it was there. Once they discovered it was there, they totally freaked out. They spent 5 years spending a fortune trying to stop it. This passed last August, after a strong AFL-CIO campaign to save this provision, the SEC finally issued regulations to allow its enforcement. So we're going to see the first ratios reported by corporations reporting what their CEO makes as a multiple of what their median worker makes by early 2018. So what's the big deal? What makes this disclosure so crucial? I think this is what makes it so crucial. With publicly disclosed executive worker pay ratio figures in place, we could begin leveraging the power of the public purse against inequality. We would have all sorts of new battlefields for egalitarian struggle If these ratios become, when they become public knowledge, activists can campaign to deny tax-free nonprofit status to institutions that compensate their executives over 10 or 25 times workers. Activists could campaign to limit top pay to in public sector employment to a modest multiple of worker pay. They could campaign to direct government subsidies only to businesses that keep executive worker pay gaps reasonable. They could deny government contracts to corporations with wide gaps. They could refuse bailouts to troubled enterprises that insist on paying their executives exorbitantly. And these struggles are starting. In the California Senate, a bill that tied executive worker pay ratios to corporate tax rate emerged a couple years ago. In Rhode Island, a bill emerged a couple years ago that tied corporate worker pay ratios to government procurement. In California, that bill actually got a Senate majority. Same thing in Rhode Island. On Capitol Hill, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, a very strong progressive figure in the House, points out right now under current law, the more corporations pay their CEOs, the more they can save off their tax bill. So her pending Income Equity Act would deny all corporations tax deductions on any executive pay that runs over 25 times the pay of a company's lowest paid worker. This report just came out from Demos, the New York think tank. It puts the total federal government spending for goods and services at over $1 trillion, and it calls on President Obama to issue an executive order that requires these companies to cap executive pay at 50 times their typical worker pay. The late historian at Columbia University, Manning Marable, took this further and talked about how unions at the bargaining table could be making this pitch, and made a point similar to what Michael said before, that if unions bargained ratios, then an executive who made $2 million would have to have workers making $50,000 annually. In Massachusetts, the nurses union is working on this CEO pay angle very successfully. And what's coming up here is what I think is an overall game plan for leveraging escalation, for the escalation of leveraging the power of the public purse. The first step, disclose, require private businesses to reveal the pay gaps. The second is support, give preferential treatment in the procurement process to enterprises with modest pay ratios. And finally, let's deny enterprises with wide ratios our tax dollars. Can any of this make a difference? Well, this is just one part. This ratio work is just one part of the work that we need to do. But I think Keith Ellison put it really very nicely 2 weeks ago. He was talking at the launch of the new Take on Wall Street campaign, which is talking about a number of things, including a tax on financial speculation. We are the money, Ellison said. We are the many, and they are the money. We are going to win this fight if we stick to it. Our predecessors, our progressive predecessors over a century ago, they won their fight. They stuck to it decade after decade. We need to do the same thing. Let me leave you with some pitches. If this interests you, if you want to keep up on this struggle, want to find out more about the top 1% and what we can do about them, please stop by inequality.org. We have a weekly newsletter that you can sign up for that I think you find very interesting. And if you want some inspiration, there's this book that I did that you might find interesting. So thank you very much for